Welcome, everybody. My name's Gary Fortney, and this is The Trend. Hello, everybody. This is our latest episode of the Trend podcast. As you know, we talk about different areas surrounding law enforcement, including true crime, law enforcement trends and issues, as well as regional issues affecting our region, which is the St. Louis region, the state of Missouri, as well as the country. So today we're going to change a little bit more. We're going to blend both the law enforcement aspect as well as the true crime aspect into our episode today. Our episode is covering two individuals. One's name is Darren Wilson, and the other is Michael Brown. And this incident happened in Ferguson, Missouri. A lot of you may be familiar with Ferguson of this incident that happened. And there's a lot of things that have been out there regarding discussions. We're not going to retry the case. This case actually never went to a trial. We're not going to redo the basic police investigation. We're going to talk about what went on behind the scenes that the public really isn't aware of, the dangers imposed by both law enforcement and the medical profession. And also we're going to talk about kind of what has happened to the region and country regarding this incident that happened. So we have two special guests today. The first is Captain Pete Morrow. Captain Morrow is in charge of the St. Louis County Police Intelligence Unit. I worked with Captain Morrow when he was a detective in the homicide unit. That's where I first worked with Pete. I did know him and his dad. His dad was a sergeant at the Greater St. Louis Police Academy. I first met his dad there. And then Pete carried on the tradition of being in law enforcement. So we're so lucky to have Pete with us today. And the second special guest we have is firefighter paramedic Clay Boyd. Clay works for the Ladue Fire Department, and Clay was actually up in the area at the time the Ferguson incidents were happening. And I say incidents, meaning this ran for several days, several weeks, and we can still feel the repercussions today of that entire incident. So Pete's going to come at it from the law enforcement part about what his involvement was, how he first heard about it, what the initial response was regarding law enforcement, regarding Code 1000s and so on. We'll talk about what that is. And Clay's going to talk about it from the perspective of the medical response, professional firefighters and paramedics, whose primary jobs are to save lives and protect property. And so we're lucky to have Clay here. He's going to discuss what he saw and what he knew. Most of the public knew and discussed the police response, but how much of you really understand what went on regarding the medical response and the professionals that were up there from the fire departments, paramedics, and so on. So anyways, I just want to welcome both of you here. Thank you a lot for joining us today. A little side note, Clay Boyd is actually the son of Larry Boyd. Larry Boyd also, he works for the Trend podcast. Larry is a research specialist, and Larry also works for Vista Law Enforcement Training and Consulting, coordinate the intern program we have. So I'm so glad that I met Larry years ago. I'm so glad that he mentioned us to his son to be on the show with us. So let's start off. August 2018. A shooting happened in the city of Ferguson. A deadly force was used by police officer Darren Wilson, who was with the Ferguson Police Department. It involved an incident that happened, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit, about what was discovered, what was learned, and the final outcome, but we're not going to go through the entire police investigation. We're going to talk about the response. And so, again, this happened in the city of Ferguson, and Ferguson is well known not only in the United States and Missouri, but around the world. I was traveling to the UK about a year after this happened, and I was on a train going to Scotland, and we were talking with some people on the train. I tell them I was a police officer in St. Louis, and they says, "Is that near Ferguson?" Right out of the blue. And so this young man and his dad started asking questions about Ferguson, because the perception was the whole world was on fire. And so I had some good conversations, and at the end of our train ride, I ended up giving the young man my challenge coin from the St. Louis County Police. And he cherished that. Hopefully he still has it today, but that's kind of how it got started about the international part of it. So let's start off with Pete. Pete, you were notified, I'm sure, at some point about what happened in Ferguson. Tell me about your first notification about what had happened, what was going on in Ferguson.
Well, I had about 20 years on at that point with the police department, all with St. Louis County. And in May of that same year, a couple months prior, I'd been promoted to lieutenant and promptly moved right to the midnight shift, permanent midnights, to a precinct that we call the Central County Precinct.
I'm sure you love that, right?
The older I got, the less I liked midnights. I'll tell you that much. I was in the Central County Precinct, and it's all the unincorporated areas within St. Louis County, but part of it adjoined the South border of Ferguson. So I had a couple beats, a couple officers that rode up there pretty close to where everything happened. So the actual day of, I worked the midnight shift the night before, got to bed about 7 a.m., woke up about 11 so I could go work secondary. And I was going to work secondary at about noon or so in an apartment complex up at Hanley and 70. And so I'm driving up there, and not too long before I reach the apartment complex, I hear all this radio traffic, and I mean a lot of radio traffic, and they start calling, the dispatcher starts calling for a code 2000, I believe, at that point, not a code 1000, and we'll certainly discuss that.
Can I pause you a second here?
Yep.
When Pete said he's going to work secondary, what secondary is, those of you that may not know? A lot of law enforcement officers work extra jobs outside of their actual duty hours. It's a chance for them to earn a little extra money for the family, earn some extra funding for themselves, and so on. So Pete was going to work secondary at the time, and that's when he got the initial call. You heard radio disturbance going on first, right?
So yeah, I heard it on the talk group, or the channel at the time. They call them talk groups now, but I thought, well, that's what is going on, and I just couldn't make heads or tails out of it on the air, so I called our dispatch center.
Well, let me back up. Sorry to interrupt you. When you said you heard a code 2000, did that mean something serious was going on?
Yeah. A code 1000 is the lowest level of that, so a 2000 is starting to work its way up a little bit in terms of staffing needed to handle a serious issue.
Okay, so code 1000 is, explain both of those, what they are, Pete. Let the listeners kind of get an understanding what that means in law enforcement talk.
So code 1000, the term code 1000 has probably been around since the early to mid 1980s. I had to call some old heads and get some background on that. Some people that you know. As best they can tell, it was probably in the mid-'80s. And another significant event in St. Louis County that happened in, I think, the late 80s was the riot out at Riverport Amphitheater. Whatever it was called back then.
With Axe and Rose and...
Guns and Roses, yes.
Yeah. Not Guns and Hoses, Guns and Roses. So I was actually working that.
There's some brawls there, too, Guns and Hoses, but that's another story. So as far back as the late 80s, we've got reference of Code 1000. So what a code... if a local or if a police chief at a particular jurisdiction has I guess they describe it as an ongoing event, and it can be man-made, it can be, Mother Nature, earthquake, floods, things like that. But usually it's called in reference to civil unrest. Well, needless to say, at that concert, they had civil unrest, and using that as an example first, I believe that was Maryland Heights, and I'm sure as it went, their chief decided, I need some help. So when you ask for one, when you ask for a code 1000, you're going to get about 25 to 30 officers and then about 5 sergeants. They're all going to deploy and come to like a command post of sorts at whatever location the issue is, or a safe location. And generally, as the years have gone on, we've certainly added fire support as well when those calls are made. And that, of course, we'll talk about in Ferguson was every single day and every single night that we all got together. So ultimately, the code 1000 is about 27 officers and 5 or 6 sergeants. And every time you go up the ladder, code 2000 is the same amount, double up. Code 3000, another 27 and 6. Code 4000, another 27 and 6. So I can tell you, not to tangent too much, but that during the civil unrest in Ferguson, I think we hit code 5000 a handful of times. Okay. And that was, we can get into this later, but that was, of course, before we started bringing hundreds of officers and pre-staging them every night as things wore on. Ultimately, the whole purpose of the code of a code 1000 on up is to provide staffing to help manage an incident.
And Pete talked about pre-staging. What that means is all officers meet at a central location, because a lot of officers responding have no idea what they're going to. They hear the code 1000, 2000, and so on. They're responding without having knowledge. Information is so important, Pete, right? They go to a staging area, centralized, where they're all briefed about what's going on. So that's what the staging was, right, Pete?
Yeah. And so in my case, I called dispatch and I said, hey, what's going on? And they described only what they knew, of course, at the time. All the facts weren't out at that point about the interaction between, Darren Wilson and Mike Brown. So I said, so what are they asking for? And they said, well, they need help. And so I drove. In fact, I was just about to pull up to the apartment complex I was going. I just kept driving north, flipped over my radio and called out, told them I was there. And I pulled up. I ended up on West Florissant, and I pulled up right in front of the Quick Trip. And it's I saw a handful of other officers there, and I never even made it back to where the scene was. There was quite a bit going on there, as we all learned.
Can I just stop? Sorry, I interrupted again, Pete, but the Quick Trip, the infamous Quick Trip. What happened to the Quick Trip eventually?
Burned to the ground.
And Quick Trip never rebuilt. And is that a shame that the citizens of that area do not have a place to go for food supplies or a place to go because of what happened? And that's people in their own city that burnt that down. So anyways, quick.
So that leads into another topic for maybe today, maybe another day. But during our the investigation that I would do later with some detectives, we discovered that there was over 100 businesses up and down West Florissant, from city limits all the way up to 270, about 100 businesses that were affected during all the civil unrest. And that was, most of what I'm going to comment on is just the first 19 nights in August. So, but to your point, there was a lot of suffering. A lot of the residents in and around the area, they had nowhere to go. They were trapped in their own house. And again, that's something we can talk about a little later. So I pull up and I park my police car. I'm in a marked car. I'm in uniform. And there's a sergeant who's now retired. He comes walking up Canfield towards West Florissant.
Was he a St. Louis County sergeant or a Ferguson sergeant?
Yeah, it was St. Louis County. It was Dave Ryan, who since retired.
Yep.
And Dave, I believe he was in special ops at the time, but they were back. He and his crew, I believe, were in the back 2700 block of Canfield handling what was going on there, the crime scene. And so he comes up on foot and he sees me and we have a conversation and hey, what's going on? So he tells me, the things that are happening, about 300-400 yards away from us back at the crime scene. And then we talk about a few more things and I look at him and I say, hey, who's in charge? And he goes, you are.
Because you're a lieutenant.
There was, there might have been some other lieutenants or captains present, but they were back towards where the incident occurred. So I now have, that's the nature of what we'll talk about and what the fire department does so well of incident command systems. Basically, the highest ranking person there is in charge for the most part. Sometimes that's not the case, but we can get into that later. But there I am. I'm in charge, and there's a lot of very upset people in and around that area where I'm at, in addition to what's going on over at the scene. And little by little, we ended up having our special ops guys come to where I was, and we kind of held off all foot traffic and vehicle traffic from coming down West Florissant to get to Canfield.
Cool. So that presents the information about who is in charge. And Captain Morrow is in charge as a lieutenant, the highest ranking officer on the scene in an area and position to be able to command personnel. All right. I'm going to move to Clay here real quick. Clay, I thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And I've known a lot about what happened in Ferguson. There's a couple ironic things that I may address a little bit later on about how I knew about Ferguson. Actually, I'll touch them now. My wife is a retired St. Louis County police sergeant, and she was up there several days in Ferguson working the scene. Very dynamic, means moving all the time in a very dangerous scene. And second of all, the lead detective on this case was the last detective I trained before I retired from the St. Louis County Homicide Unit and Police Department. Well, anyways, a little bit of a personal feelings about that case. So, Clay, when did you first hear about an unrest that happened in Ferguson?
So, interestingly enough, the night of the night after the shooting happened, or the night of the shooting, I was at a pool party of a county police sergeant. It's kind of the nice thing about working up there, and EMS for the hospital-based service up there, which covered most of that area, including Ferguson, was we developed good relationships with all the police officers that we were on scenes with. So there was some chatter at the party about an officer-involved shooting that happened in Ferguson and kind of a little bit of civil unrest in the Canfield apartments, which I was very familiar with, that apartment complex, just from running a variety of calls in there over the years. So fast forward to the next day, I was scheduled to work the night shift as the EMS supervisor for that area, which again included Ferguson. Slept throughout the day as I was preparing to be up all night, so really was kind of out of the loop when I reported to work. And my relief just kind of briefed me and said that it's just weird out there. And I asked, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, you'll just see. Okay, started my shift off, went to not the Quick Trip, but a Quick Trip, and got a fountain drink. How else do you start off a shift? And I felt it. I was getting some weird looks. And to kind of paint the picture, the command vehicle I had was a white Tahoe with a spotlight and a light bar, and I'm in a white button-down shirt with a badge. And so if you don't read the decals, or if you don't pay attention to the uniform, I look like a police officer in a police car. So
you're in trouble.
Yeah. Again, I didn't fully grasp, what was going on, the extent of it. And then we get dispatched to a call in Canfield for a medical call very close to the crime scene. So I book myself in on it with the ambulance and one of the ladder trucks from Ferguson Fire Department. And right at West Forest and Canfield, luckily I ended up kind of falling in with their convoy of, again, the ladder truck, the ambulance, several police vehicles from Ferguson. And almost immediately when we get in the apartment complex, we get surrounded. Still in our vehicles by hundreds of people. And they've actually stopped the ladder truck. At that point, I'm realizing this is not good. You have a bunch of people that now stopped a massive ladder truck. We're all behind them, so we're stuck. And they're beating on the vehicles, spitting at us, whatnot, yelling, and again, not realizing that I'm not a police officer. Finally, we're able to clear the way, get in there, just to realize that this is essentially a crow call. It was a call, most likely to draw us into the area. So at that point, we made the decision between kind of fire and EMS to use a lot more caution until further notice going into that area. They had a candlelight vigil scheduled for that night near the kind of the Quick Trip and the Ferguson Market, and I ended up staging farther up West Florissant. And I still had a whole district that I was running too. So wow. there's other calls going on that are completely unrelated that I'm responsible for. And so I just kind of post up by this other Quick Trip up there, and I switched my second radio over to County First Precinct. I was able to scan their channel. Shortly after this vigil starts, the radios kick up. They're requesting more units. All of a sudden, it goes to a code 1000, and so I'm starting to see units responding down West Florissant, and before we know it, we've got calls for assaults, and then eventually the structure fire at Quick Trip. So I ended up also staged across the street watching Quick Trip burn and watching the fire department do their best to try and get in there to apply some fire suppression, but they were encountering bricks, blockades. Every time they tried to get in, they weren't able to get anywhere near that structure to try and put out the fire.
Clay, were you a supervisor at the time?
I was. Yeah, I was a part-time supervisor.
Yeah, well, think about that. Being we have a supervisor from the EMS, emergency response for medical, as well as fire. And then we also have Pete, who is the supervisor for police. So lucky to have these two individuals with us. And how about a little off note? I want to thank your dad for giving you such good genetics. You got the best radio voice. You got the best voice of anybody we had so far in the podcast. So you have great voice, okay, for this.
I've that before. We have a face for radio as well.
Your voice, you got it. So thank you, Larry, wherever you are, for giving your son good genetics, for having a good radio voice and a good picture voice, or a picture too. Yeah, very interesting. So being a supervisor, and you were watching a Quick Trip burn. I'm going to get with Pete a little bit, but your job as a firefighter, paramedic, and the other firefighters is to respond, save property, and save lives. And how frustrating was that, watching you guys not be able to get there?
It was extremely frustrating, and I felt really bad for the fire crew. Because again, my job that night is, I was still part-time. I'd been full-time for this hospital-based agency for a number of years before I went part-time, and that's when I went to Ladue Fire Department. So I'd worked in this area for a long time. I had ties to that community. I felt a sense of ownership from working there so long.
Sense of ownership to the community.
And then also, even though my job that night was just paramedic supervisor, also being a firefighter, I'd never encountered anything like this where somebody had prevented us in such a flagrant way from accessing a building that was on fire and potentially people that were in danger.
Did you know if anybody was inside or not?
I did not. We had reports that it had been evacuated, which ended up being, we knew after the fact were true, that they were able to evacuate. But when the fire started, there were people inside.
And I just want to talk a little bit about this, and Clay knows more than me. I'll talk about it from my perspective as a police officer and detective. When firefighters arrive on the scene, they treat a fire different if they know the building's empty versus something that needs rescue. And it's completely different, right, Clay, about the response, what they do?
Yes, to a degree. I mean, every building gets searched. We do what's called a primary and a secondary search. So even if we think a building's vacant or abandoned, no matter for how long, we're going to make every effort to search every space we can in that building where there could reasonably be a survivor. However, if we have, certain times of the day, we know certain buildings are occupied, a school, for example. At midnight, maybe you have custodial staff or maintenance staff. Big difference between noon on a school day. So we apply that kind of mental model to every type of structure. Clearly, a Quick Trip is always going to be occupied. And if we know that there's occupants or know that there's a high degree of suspicion that there might be occupants, we're going to be a lot more aggressive.
And I know I brought up the Quick Trip several times. In my own personal observation, when they let that Quick Trip burn, I'm not saying when that Quick Trip burned, it emboldened the crowd. Pete, talk about that, and about when were you there when a Quick Trip was on fire?
I apologize, which night was that?
That was the second.
Not the night of the shooting, but
the following?
Yeah,
following night.
Yeah, I was not there, so I don't have a firsthand account of it, but I was in a 3-officer car. It was me, my sergeant, Brian Shanica, Brian, and a brand new officer named Brittany Klein. In fact, she just got promoted to sergeant. She's still with us. And the three of us, we rode from call to call to call for looters. I mean, there was a ton of looting that night up and down Halls Ferry, West Florissant, in the surrounding area. So I didn't have any, direct. I didn't witness that.
But obviously, you heard about it. You've talked about it. Is your thought the same about? I know we're talking about the quick trip a lot, but having that burn in the community. What did you think? You have a thought, I'm sure, about that.
Yeah. So at some point, and the fire chiefs that were there making these decisions, and we had something that wasn't in place yet, but it was kind of a de facto unified command. And ultimately what that means is if there's an incident, the discipline, meaning the police department or the fire department that handles the incident, is based on what the problem is. If it's a fire, we're staying back, and we're offering support and watching their equipment, that kind of thing. If it's civil unrest, then we're involved, and we're going to handle it, and they do the same for us. But that night, so when that decides to go, the chiefs of police, John Belmer and his executive command at the time, and then certainly the fire chiefs that were all involved, they have to come to some sort of decision that this is now it's too late. This is now going to be more dangerous for the first responders than it is not to try and put it out. And I think once that happened, we knew collectively that, this is like nothing we've ever seen in my career. So to answer your question, this was not going to go well.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Just your instinct and such. Clay, there's hot scenes that go on. Hot scenes mean there's gunfire, unsafe things. And to have unarmed paramedics and firefighters go into a hot area is pretty dangerous. And so can you talk about that a little bit, about what happened regarding...
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of our policy in general, and this is aside, we have a separate policy for active shooter incidents. But in general, we stage for law enforcement. In fact, we're kind of the butt of the jokes. Police and fire, and we're second in after they secure. But anyway, we do. We're unarmed, and up until this point, the idea of body armor in EMS or fire was kind of foreign, kind of taboo almost. So essentially, we had no body armor. We're not armed. We're not even heavily trained in defensive tactics. So we rely on law enforcement to go into those hot scenes, if you will. If there's clear reports of violence or there's agitated parties or whatnot, and then they secure it for us. We move in and we do our job, and they maintain that security for us to allow us to help the patients or to mitigate the structure fire, whatever needs to be done on our end.
Well, Vista Law Enforcement Training Consulting is more than willing to train all firefighter personnel in defensive tactics and ways to protect themselves. It's just got
I would look forward to it.
Anyways, all right, we're going to jump a little bit ahead here, and then we're going to talk about both of your responses. I'm going to start off with Pete. Pete, you talk about a unified command, which means individuals from different jurisdictions and different areas of first responders to coordinate. How many arrests were made, or estimate of arrests that were made during the time of the Ferguson arrest?
So again, I can get you a number for about the first 19 nights, August 9th through, and I think the governor declared that peace had been restored something 20 nights later, 21 nights later. I mean, that's a whole nother story, I know, but
yes.
Somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 arrests in about 19 nights.
And let's think about this. A lot of you on TV or saw on TV or saw law enforcement officers arresting people. If you just arrest somebody and put them in the back of a police car or back of a transport van, it's not done. You're just don't arrest them, let them go. The legal processes that take place regarding processing prisoners, making sure that they're fingerprinted, making sure they're identified, is a long process per person. So think about the manpower that goes along with removing officers from the street or from the disturbance to start processing, and the coordination that takes place is very big. And Pete, you're involved in that a little bit further regarding the police report preparation as well as the let's say administrative aspect.
Yeah, so the overall line that I'll use to explain how things went is that the old saying that everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. Okay, you assign that to whoever you want to assign it to, but I think you know who I'm talking about. So the 9th, August 9th was what it was, but it didn't really start picking up with people, more people showing up until the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, as time went on. We drew, and again, I'll get back to what you're asking, Gary, but it started to become a national theater. Every dish truck, every satellite truck that showed up, it made it worse for us, meaning all first responders. Now we had every protest group you can think of showed up because they wanted in on the action. They didn't really probably know much about what happened on Canfield at all. They just knew they were going to be seen, and and they weren't wrong. So we ended up getting, in a lot of these arrests, we ended up getting people from coast to coast showing up. I think just the 250 arrests from the first 19 nights. I think about 120 or so were local folks in St. Louis County, St. Louis City, other side of the river, Illinois. About half that was from St. Louis City, I should say. And then there was about 50 from out of state.
That's something showing up just to create disturbance, destroy the areas they don't even live in. So
yeah, and it was so. Back to getting punched, you have to kind of they essentially got into our OODA loop, the Colonel John Boyd described. You make an arrest, you have a workflow, you take them down to the intake, get them booked, then you write your report. Well, we didn't have time to do that night after night after night, because it was a riot. It was mayhem at times. It didn't start that way, but the night watch always ended up that way. I worked every night 6P to 6A, and so you just almost can't keep up with it. So as a result, about a week in, maybe 2 weeks, about a week in, the chief and the others, they decided, hey, we've got to get this under wraps. And so they assigned a crew at that time to account for all the arrests and report numbers and see, what we needed to do and not do still. And then, as you know, in about October, the litigation started rolling in. So then it's at that time that I got more involved, and it was me and Detective Menzenworth at Big Ed, Paul Eckinger, and then Bob Wolf. The four of us were assigned by Chief Belmer to make sure every single arrest those first 19 nights was squared away and documented. And that's what we did.
And again, the administrative stuff that goes on behind the scenes, it didn't end the first year. I mean, we'll talk about what went on a little bit more about what's involved in the report preparation, identification, so on. Like, how many days were you up there, if you can add it up total?
Oh, wow. So, I still had my full-time shifts at Ladue, which were 2 days a week. But other than that, I pretty much spent all my days off up there by choice. I chose to sign up for those shifts. I felt that I'd worked there for a number of years, and I felt that I needed to be there. I'm not one of those that can just sit at home and watch something like that go on. I would have to say, just in the first round, probably 20-something shifts.
Wow.
Between not all of them were supervisors. Sometimes I was working on the ambulance with the strike teams. So I did a lot of that, too, out of the command post.
So not only were you there, did you get calls for service for medical services and other responses?
We did. We didn't get luckily we didn't have any major officer down calls. That was our biggest fear, especially hearing a lot of the radio chatter from the command post of shots fired and rocks being thrown at officers. We had some minor injuries that we had to treat with rocks and bottles. Luckily, no major, officer down with a serious injury, although we did have a plan
at that time.
At that time, yes. So in addition to kind of the tear gas exposure, OC exposure, just protesters assaulting each other a lot of the times. Again, that was a highly populated residential area around those areas. So there's people still living there, and they're experiencing medical emergencies. We're trying to get to those people that have nothing to do with the actual protests going on. They're just kind of, like you said, stuck in their own homes. A lot of people even delayed calling us to later in the night. And they were very sick by the time they called us. And they even mentioned, I didn't want to bother you guys because I know you're busy. So that's kind of the unfortunate part is that there are a lot of the citizens there that live there didn't have the access to the help that they needed when they needed it.
The delayed response by them being tasked in an area of the civil unrest. Clay mentioned OC. OC stands for Oil Rides and Capsicum. Many of you may not know what that is. That's actually pepper spray. And pepper spray deployment has taken place of, quote, tear gas throughout the years. And did that fill the air out there, guys?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm well familiar with it now. Luckily didn't get any direct exposure per se, but it definitely permeated the air, and I'll never forget that smell.
The secondary contamination of OC is very pronounced. Let's say I'm an instructor in OC. I've been sprayed before. I don't like it. I'd rather be hit with an asp or tased than it would be OC. But think about that, the hanging in the air of the OC, which is the tear gas deployments, and medical response there too in the same time. So yeah, you're up there quite a bit, and volunteering your time. You're still working, but you're volunteering on your time off. You're working on your days off, taking extra time. And like when you said, ownership of the community, because you've been up there for a while, you knew the area, and to help the citizens in a professional basis as you in law enforcement versus the citizens who live in the area tearing it down. And that's disheartening to me, guys. I mean, if you understand. Pete, so let's jump a little bit of ahead here, all right? When do you think things started slowing down for the police response?
So in that first month, I think if we're going to use arrests as an indicator, probably I think we peaked with arrests especially the evening, 9 days in, 10 days. Because by then we had all sorts of people from, like I said, come. They realized, hey, they're out of towners, and they realized this is going to go on for a while. So it took them 3 or 4 days to get there and handle their business, find a place to stay and do their thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, the probably about 9 or 10 days in, and then the arrests, again, using that as an indicator, started to reduce as time went on. And then by the time we got to that 19th day, then it had quieted down.
Good. I like the word quieted down. It didn't.
How's
end,
that?
right? It didn't end.
No, it was not. There was always, as the fire service can speak to, there was a continual risk for all of us out there.
And you know the worst thing I feel about firefighters, paramedics, and Clay's position is, these guys are out there trying to save lives, do what they can. Police is more quelling the disturbance, and to have you guys placed in danger, it hurts me because I think about your job and what your profession is and what you do, and to have that disrupted by the people. And you can recognize an ambulance, you can recognize a fire truck, and have that disrupted by people who are trying to save lives, even people that they know. So when did you start to notice things slowing down from your perspective? On there.
His timeline's probably accurate, and kind of going into the incident management, we talk about demobilizing the command, the unified command that had been established between police and fire and EMS. And it's probably around that timeline where we kind of took down the big command post and we started going back to operations as normal, if you will, meaning the same amount of trucks on, staffing went back to normal. However, we had some new standard operating guidelines where we had now incorporated the body armor, as mandatory for any call in certain areas, what we ended up calling as the hot zone. Yep. And then it was crew discretion in the other areas of our district, which is a 110 square mile district. And so it was a new normal, but it was normal in a sense that we went back to our normal staffing, our normal assignments, and no more unified command for the time being.
When you were up there, did you hear gunshots?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Think about that. Okay, so what I'm getting ahead of here is this is before they had body armor and other protective things, and they're hearing gunshots, and they still need to respond. And again, they know it's a fire truck or ambulance or paramedics or lifesavers, and to have that kind of environment that's taking place. You guys did a great job. We're not done with the podcast. I just want to thank you for all you do. Some of the unsung heroes, all right, are the ones that you don't see a lot, and we can't thank everybody enough. About the investigation, so we're going to jump a little bit ahead here to the investigative part. I'm going to kick this off here with a couple of things. Barack Obama was president at the time. I'm not going to make this political. As we say, we have the facts without the politics, all right? But Barack Obama was president, and then you had Eric Holder was in charge of the Justice Department, all right? Attorney General. The investigation that took place after this was very interesting to me because, if I'm not mistaken, they sent 50 FBI agents to Ferguson to investigate this incident. Now, this is a multi-tier investigation that took place. What do I mean by that? You have multiple jurisdictions. St. Louis County was in charge of the county response, and Ferguson did not do this for prevention of a conflict of interest. And they also did this as a prevention of any issues that Ferguson can be blamed regarding the results of the investigation. And regarding the investigation, I'm going to touch on something too. Being a homicide detective, we had bodies and victims that remained on place when they were deceased. There was a big uprising because Michael Brown's body was on the scene for several hours. And there's criticism that police left the body there on display, or they didn't care to remove the body. And there are other things that were taking place regarding the investigation on the scene. And I heard all that taking place. A couple of things. First, you're not going to have the medical examiner's office going into a hot zone where there's gunshots taking place. That delayed it. The officers were in danger of they were getting shot at around the area where Michael Brown's body was. All right. So yes, it took several hours to remove Michael Brown's body from the scene. Let me mention it. What if law enforcement would have taken that body out within a half hour, Pete? But what would people be saying if you took it out so quick?
Compromised the investigation. Evidence involved.
The police purposely removed that body so quick, and therefore they wanted to hide evidence, and the public would never know, and they're going to protect the officer. And then the body stays there for the investigative part, and then they get criticized for that. I'll use a golf term for this. In addition, we're filming at a beautiful Old Hickory Golf Club today. And so anyways, we're filming I really appreciate Old Hickory letting us do the episode here today. But there's no mulligans in this investigation. There's no redos. You can't go and redo a scene. If you move a body too quick, you move a body where you can't do the proper investigation, things are not going to be right. So a judgment made. I agree with the judgment, leaving the body there for the investigation. So Pete, you had 50 FBI agents on the scene, right?
Yeah, that was the number we were told. Yeah. And I will tell you I was generally the 6P to 6A shift. So by the time I got in every night, I never saw them.
Okay. Why do I bring that up? It's not a criticism of the FBI Justice Department. I'm going to tell you, there's a thorough investigation done. I actually have the Department of Justice report, the final report that was prepared by the FBI and the Justice Department reviewing this case, all right? And that's part of it, too. Clay, did you guys prepare reports or after action reports after this happened?
Not to the extent, not necessarily an investigative report, not in that much detail, but we do both formal and informal debriefs. You know, our chief of the EMS department at the time, he was very progressive. I give him a lot of credit. You know, he was an Air Force PJ before he got into EMS, so just a very used to working in command systems and very good at debriefing. So we did some morning debriefs, both for the mental health aspect of going into this new type of response, making sure that everyone's okay that was, but also, hey, what worked well, what didn't? Is our incident action plan doing everything we can to keep us safe, but also provide the services that we're there to provide and be there to support law enforcement? And so with that, and then we had also the incident action plans that were, we talk about the unified command, the chief level officers and high ranking officers that's their job, is planning, and they're planning each day who's going to be our staffing, where are our units, where are they going to be, how are we going to respond.
The police and first responders did not want this to happen. They did not want it to go on. The police did not like being up there. And let me talk about this real quick. A lot of the minority officers that were on the front line, all right, they took a verbal abuse that you can't imagine, okay? And from minorities, about being up there and being police officers and so on. So I feel for every officer that was up there, every single officer that was up there. I also feel for every single firefighter, paramedic, and first responder up there, too, because of a very dynamic situation. Mental health. Again, I don't want to take up too much time because we're going to get close to ending the podcast here. Pete and Clay, did anybody struggle with any instance of, I don't want to say mental breakup, any mental health issues?
Yeah, I think so. I think it caused, particularly on the EMS side and maybe in fire side too, some people to kind of evaluate, is this the career for me? I think it was something that we had never been exposed to. You had the issues in the 90s in LA and stuff like that, but this was a whole new thing. You had social media played such a huge role in it, and the misinformation, and just having a district that you'd worked in for so long, almost areas of it almost unrecognizable afterwards. So I think it did absolutely take a toll on both law enforcement, very much so, and then even the EMS and fire side as well.
Pete, what about on your side for the mental health of the officers involved?
Well, I can tell you that it was had a pretty dramatic effect on everybody.
And he said everybody, so yeah,
everybody. And Gary and I, we've talked about this. For me, is just, I told you I didn't care for midnights much anyway. So I didn't roll into that. I didn't roll into August 9th with a lot of well rested. How's that? And that had it took me probably 12 months to get right, quote unquote, 12 to 15 months even. I just couldn't, the fire wouldn't burn out, so to speak, the internal, the stress, the anxiety. But, my department, St. Louis County, did a very good job addressing what they could at the time. And since they've built up, our wellness and all those types of things. But, all those things are very much needed when these types of incidents occur, for sure. But at the time, it was department wide. I mean, it was hurting all of us.
Do you guys have wellness programs within the fire protection district?
We do. It's probably similar to law enforcement now. It's, that they're trying to remove the stigma about it and offer, both employers and through our union and organizations like Responder Rescue offer a lot of access to those services. And
that's great. It was not known when I first became a police officer a long time ago. Officers were perceived as weak or you can't handle it and all this other stuff. And that wasn't true. Every officer can handle different things differently. Seeing dead bodies in my profession, and Pete did too, and I'm sure yours too, people can handle that. Some people can't. It doesn't mean they're weak. They just have adaptabilities to other situations that happen. The mental health part of the officers and the first responders, to me, is a forgotten part. And I want everybody in the public to realize they're not machines. They are humans with human behaviors, right? The human side of things is all but forgotten sometimes. And to take care of the professionals, to make them recover mentally is just as important as physically, because they still have to go on. And we still have Clay still being a firefighter paramedic. Pete is now a captain, been promoted, and they persevere. But it wasn't an easy time for them. And I know a lot of stories behind the scenes, officers that had struggles, all right? And thank God, some officers left the profession after that. I'm not going to get too much into the personal aspect of that. They've left the profession. And speaking of the profession, the Ferguson effect. How about you, Clay, from a non-police? You familiar with the Ferguson effect?
I am. In fact, we've used the term as far as our own kind of recruitment, if you will. And I don't mean to, it's in no way as significant as it is for law enforcement.
Oh, but it's still significant. You guys were out there.
It is. We've seen it. And I don't have figures or anything, but as far as getting people into the field, we've seen a lot of a drop in interest in the career, enrollment in the educational and the training programs, the academy. Just to kind of throw ballpark numbers out there, when I applied at the fire department I'm with now, I think when I showed up to test, I was one of like 65 people. For at the time, 1 or 2 positions open. And now we're lucky if we get, applications in the teens. That would be, and it's not just us, it's region-wide, it's nationwide. And I know the numbers in law enforcement are even more dismal.
Clay, I want to congratulate you for staying in the career, what you do. You guys are there to save lives and all you do. So you're not thanked enough. So.
I appreciate it.
And
I love it.
We have a fun rivalry. We have a fun rivalry between police and firefighters. It's always kind of fun.
We do.
But the brotherhood's there, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Go away.
We always invite them for our holiday dinners up at the station.
They do. I mean, all of them are cooks. They make the best food. So anyways,
we do.
Hey, Pete, we're going to kind of get close to wrapping this up here. We want to don't forget about 2 hero officers. 2 hero officers, one Webster Groves police officer, one St. Louis County police officer. They were holding the line in front of the Ferguson police station. Holding the line means that there was a line of officers protecting property and lives. And both officers were shot in the line of duty. All right. One officer, a Webster Groves officer, was shot in the face. Another officer was shot, I think, in the back, and either the back or through the shoulder area, progressed through his back area, created very serious injuries for both officers. Both survived. All right. And I'm not going to talk too much about the St. Louis County officer, who I do know. The Webster Groves officer I got to know on a personal basis, all right? And the struggles he had regarding the struggles that he had surviving that, okay, both physically and mentally, was very pronounced. So let's not forget about the 2 hero officers who almost gave their lives for this. Were either of you there when the shooting happened, of either of those officers?
I was not. I was one of the nights when I was on duty at my full-time fire department.
Pete,
Same.
I do remember.
I know a little bit about it. I'm not going to get into it. It's not the proper area. But thank you, 2 officers, for being heroes in my book and all of our books, surviving. And another thanks to Chief Belmar, the command structure of the St. Louis County, and all other municipal police departments who were out there, who worked hard to maintain civil order. And it's a job, everybody. It's a career, but it was a job that day, working hard, and we can't forget anybody. Let's look at the aftermath here. Pete, St. Louis County wrote a long report, right?
Yeah, 2 of them.
Yeah,
one for the incident, and then one that my crew did.
Yep. Pete's crew, and Pete was in charge. Pete's the lieutenant in charge. And Pete, your officers wrote, I think Ed Menzelworth wrote the report. Big Ed. I knew Ed when I worked homicide with him. The majority of the report, that detailed the administrative part of arrests, detainments, more of the legal aspect. The investigative report that was written by, I'm not going to say his name right now, but anyways, the lead detective for St. Louis County, he wrote the investigative report regarding the incident involving police officer Darren Wilson and the culpability or not culpability on his part regarding using deadly force in that circumstance, all right? Ultimately, the case went before the St. Louis County grand jury. The FBI did a complete investigation, and the case, when it went to the grand jury, they had hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, and people were allowed to come in there in any capacity to present their information. Pete, was there basically something that turned out not to be true that perpetuated the start of the movement against police? What was the quote? Let me think of it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hands up, don't shoot. Did that happen, Pete?
Yeah, they did not.
It did not. A lot of people still believe it did. I'm a college professor, and also I teach a lot of law enforcement agencies. Not law enforcement much, but a lot of the college students, they think that really happened still. Hands up, don't shoot. Or they believe Michael Brown was shot in the back by Officer Wilson. That is not the case. There was so much information going out that is not true, that has still affected the public's perception of policing. And I do not like stereotyping all people in one group. And that comes down to recruiting. As Clay just mentioned, it used to be 60, 70 people per opening, and firefighter paramedics, it's hard to get into that. You have to be a firefighter, EMT, then work your way up to a paramedic, okay, for firefighter. And the pay's good, the pension's good union, so on. Police departments, they can't recruit officers right now. And that's still a hangover of the Black Lives Matter movement through Ferguson, eventually through the George Floyd incident. Pete, what do you think about the recruiting, or what do you think we could do to try to get more officers in the profession?
Well, time. We need time. I mean, it's been coming up on 10 years, but we still need more time. I just, if you go back to what you were just talking about information being spread through social media, you got a young man or woman who wants to get into, be a first responder, regardless of the discipline, and they start, hit the Google machine, see what's going on. I'm not going to do that. So that's what we're up against. There's just word of mouth. If it's negative, then it's that, that's gonna hurt a lot more than advertising that we're able to do to try and dispute that type of thing.
Well, my position here is I'm retired. All right. My career's over. But what can I still do for the profession is this: having two professionals that are still in the business talk about it, and the nobility and the, how can I say, the profession that is still noble to everybody to try to get involved in. So I want to talk about the positive aspects of the police and first responder response. We're going to have an episode we're going to be filming at the St. Louis County and Municipal Police Academy with one of the training sergeants. We're going to talk about trying to recruit officers, about what goes on behind the scenes. We're going to talk about some of the things that are not true versus what are the positives of the profession. That'll be a future episode release. So yeah, we'll talk about what went on behind the scenes, or what goes on regarding training, recruitment, and try to get young people into the profession. The people that complain about the profession, all right, sign up. Fill out an application. If you're criticized, come in and make a difference. If you're going to criticize law enforcement, why don't you just join and make a difference yourself, all right, first of all. And I'm going to close down with something that happened recently. When I was a police academy instructor, I trained a young recruit, all right? His name was Troy Doyle. Troy Doyle eventually became a lieutenant colonel for the St. Louis County Police Department. And I knew Troy throughout his whole career, all right? Troy Doyle is now, Peter?
Chief of Ferguson, PD?
Chief of Ferguson Police Department. He worked through the advancement in his career to become the chief of the Ferguson Police Department. An incident happened last year. I think it was last year.
Last August.
Last August. The anniversary of the Michael Brown incident, where a young officer was trying to protect some disturbance. The officer was pushed to the ground. The officer suffered a very serious head injury, and to this day is alive. He's very, very challenging trying to recover from this incident. He actually went to another state to try to recover serious head injury. Chief Doyle said something. I respect Chief Doyle for this. And again, I've known Chief Doyle a long time. He goes, "What else do you want?" None of the officers that were here at the time that happened are still here. We had a consent decree by the Department of Justice that watched over the department for the restructure of the department. Chief Doyle was not the chief when it happened. Chief Doyle's running the department. All new officers, not even some of the people are around when this happened. But you had a young officer who was severely injured during the civil disturbance where he sustained a serious head injury. And Chief Doyle says, what else do you want? They changed uniforms. They changed the entire structure. Not Pete. They made some changes like that.
He said, what did he say? Why? Something to the effect, paraphrasing, why are we still a punching bag for protesters? And I couldn't have said it any better.
Yeah.
Everything that could have been done was done.
Yeah, it's kind of disheartening. Godspeed to the officer who was injured and to the surviving officers who were shot on the front line in Ferguson, and to my fellow brothers and sisters in the profession. Again, my wife's a retired police officer. I am retired. I'm out of the game, but my heart's still there. All right. I don't have to do this, but I enjoy so much and have professionals like Clay and Pete here talking about what they experienced. We may have a subsequent episode about this a little bit. Again, we're not going to talk about politics. We're not going to talk about what happened as much, but all we know is that Darren Wilson was found not culpable, not guilty, or whatever you want to say. It did not even go to a trial. He was cleared by the grand jury of numerous days, numerous evidence, numerous witnesses, and the Department of Justice cleared him. And their Department of Justice report, which I have read, I have a copy of, and there was a documentary made several years ago after the incident that tried to stir it up. And what makes me sad is the wounds were healing in Ferguson. The wounds were healing. The certain documentary was made that ripped the Band-Aid off of a wound and stirred it all up. And when that was made, I know who did it. It's been out there in the domain. And there's a lot of things that I would consider inaccurate in that documentary. And that hurt the rebuilding. So God willing, we'll have a Ferguson rebuilt. We'll have police officers and first responders applying for the profession. This is still a noble profession. We love all you guys out there, and the ladies and the gentlemen in police work and first responders. You do God's work, and don't forget that. All right. So I want to thank Clay for being here today.
Thank you for having me,
Pete. Thank you so much. I know we didn't touch too much on the case. We just want to talk about what went on behind the scenes, the personalities and personal issues and struggles the officers and first responders had. So this is Gary Fortney. Thank you so much for listening, and listen to us as future episodes come up on the Trend podcast. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this episode of The Trend. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us at the Trend's website at www.trendmediallc.com, or you can email us at any time at thetrend@trendmediallc.com. We welcome everybody's comments, suggestions, or reviews. Don't forget to stay connected with us on social media. Follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Trend Media Podcast, and join the conversation on Facebook by searching the Trend Podcast. Check out our Amazon page through the link on our website, where you'll find some of our recommended products. We'll be back next time with more true crime stories, insights on law enforcement trends, and current trends with our region and the people we serve. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay part of the trend.